This presentation will introduce the elements of theater for our Unit 4 in World of the Arts. These terms will be useful to you when you're writing about theater, both in your events review and also when you post to the online discussions. If we look at just the real essence of theater, it's a way of personalizing emotions. We watch actors and actresses act out various situations that help us to recognize the feelings that they are portraying: love, joy, sadness. And when you're watching theater, you can go beyond reality while still having a situation that is something we can relate to. Sometimes that exaggeration can be very effective, but because we're in the relative emotional safety of a theater, we can watch something that really does either go beyond reality or go beyond what would be tolerable in our own life. The third point on this slide is about the idea that when we're in a theater, we suspend disbelief. On the one hand, we know we're in a theater and that everyone is really pretending. But on the other hand, generally speaking, especially if a play or a movie is effective, you become involved in the story and you start to relate to it as if it's real. You suspend your disbelief. Some elements of theater are very similar to going to the movies, but there's one very important way in which it's not similar, and that actually is on to the second to last point on this slide, where there's kind of a contract between what's going on stage and what's happening in the audience in a play. In a play, the performers are in the room with us, and we respond to them and they respond to us. So it's a bit of a contract. It's like the audience agrees to suspend disbelief, to feel empathy for the characters, and actually even to display appropriate empathy. Think how distracting it would be if something terrible happened on stage and someone in the audience laughed or reacted inappropriately. It's like a social contract. And then on the stage part of this, the actors are sort of promised to remain in character, not to come out of character and interact as themselves, but to portray the inner feelings and the psychology of the character they're playing. The last point on this slide is just meant to encourage you to look for the thought or the meaning behind a play. A lot of times a play is very entertaining, really fun to attend, and has a good story and some interesting characters on stage. But it's important to realize that a lot of times, even in a comedy, there's a theme or a message or an idea that's being portrayed, and it's good to think about that even as you're watching the play, so that when you come away from the play, you are in some way changed. You've had a thought or you've had a revelation. Something has occurred to you that might not have if you had not attended the play. This slide shows the main genres of theater. You'll recognize many of these words. Tragedy generally ends unhappily. Tragedy has existed as a theater genre since the ancient Greek times. Its meaning and the implications of the word tragedy have changed over time. The 20th century playwright Arthur Miller describes tragedy as, quote, the consequences of a man's compulsion to evaluate himself justly, and his destruction in the attempt posits a wrong or an evil in his environment, end quote. So in a Miller tragedy, the idea is that there's oftentimes an ordinary man trying to find his place in the world or to judge himself justly. And if he is not able to do that, there's a fault in his environment, there's a fault in his circumstances that he has to struggle against. It's quite different from ancient Greek tragedy. In ancient Greek tragedy, the protagonist of the play was generally a larger-than-life hero. The real defining element that made it a tragedy was this hero's fatal flaw, which would lead to his or her own downfall. And so you can see there's quite a difference in what tragedy implies. However, you can generalize and say that a tragedy is going to have an unhappy ending. A comedy is, in a way, a more complex genre because it covers so many different possibilities. Comedy can range from farce, with slapstick humor and silliness abounding, to satire. And in a satire, generally, you would take a powerful figure and ridicule that figure to reveal his or her flaws and foolishness. And so these are really wide-ranging styles of comedy, but the similarity or the commonality would be that they are based on humor. A tragedy comedy is a mixed genre. Oftentimes it will start tragically, but the ending is not necessarily unhappy. The mood can likewise shift from a heavy mood to a light mood. Another kind of play that might be described as a tragicomedy is a serious play that has enough humor that it actually lightens the mood and becomes a mix of tragedy and comedy, hence the name. A melodrama is a genre that didn't exist in the ancient Greek culture, but since it did come into existence, particularly in the 19th century, but continuing to our own day, it has been very popular. A melodrama is perhaps predictable a lot of the time. You have good guys fighting against bad guys. Generally, there's a circumstance or a situation in which it's easy to see what we would generally want to happen. And we often almost know that the good guys are going to win. The last genre listed on this slide is modern theater. And this may have begun with Bertolt Brecht, the playwright who rejected the traditional forms of theater and was looking to shock audiences. Some people use the term alienation theater, where these conventions are ignored or flouted. With modern theater and with performance art, that's another way of identifying a theater genre that does not follow convention. And of course, then there's no predetermined formula. I had mentioned tragedy originating back in the ancient Greek era. And in fact, theater was very important in ancient Greece. There was a huge annual festival held every year. Thousands and thousands of people went. And it was considered a big part of the culture. So it's not surprising that Aristotle would have written about theater. We're going to look at the 6 elements of theater that he described, and I've got a list of them here that you can write down if you want to stop the presentation, but we'll go through each element and discuss it in a little bit more detail. The first element that